All right, folks. Welcome to the VulnWise Show, where we bring you exclusive interviews with cybersecurity experts and thought leaders to conquer the chaos of vulnerability and exposure management while drinking coffee. I'm Steve Carter, the CEO and co-founder at Nucleus Security. I'm joined by my partner in crime, Scott Kuffer, who is the COO and a co-founder at Nucleus Security. And today's show is going to be a real banger because we have the one and only Johnny Shaieb as our guest today. If you don't know Johnny, he is the chief architect of exposure management at IBM, and he's worked there for over 22 years. In his copious free time, he's highly involved with academia. He teaches cybersecurity courses. He advises educational institutions, and he's working on his PhD dissertation. So a
I
busy
think he's
man.
already earned the PhD, to be honest. I feel
No,
like this is just an honorary at this point.
I wish that was true, but when you go through a PhD, it gives you a whole new respect to folks that have it, from, an accredited school, especially like the University of Tulsa. It is not easy.
It's a
Um,
journey. I think that's the way you put it, right? In our last message, it's a journey. And I know you two got to know each other last year when Scott published some article that had something to do with the NVD, and I'm guessing that
yeah.
caught your attention because it was related to your research and your dissertation, right?
At that time, I was talking to Peter Mount, and actually, I still talk to Peter Mount to this day, but I was doing heavy research on NVD. And you know what's interesting? A lot of people don't really know the history of NVD. Even if you go out to the NIST webpage today, well, maybe they probably made corrections after I talked to Peter. But before NVD, there was ICAT, and before ICAT, there was GAT. And the whole community is interlinked. Like I never really realized that Peter Mel, his professor, was Dr. Bishop, and Dr. Bishop was one of the original CVE board members, and he actually developed a database himself called Dove. And so part of the PhD is going back from the inception of when vulnerability databases were really born and just kind of following who did what. Can a taxonomy be created? I think we already know the answer to that. Not really. It's more like an ontology, this
Right.
thing that keeps scaling and expanding as new attack vectors are created. And then hence we kind of move on from vulnerability to exposure management. But um, it's really nothing new. I mean, because what does CVE actually stand for? Common vulnerability and exposure. But that's a whole new story. That's a very interesting story that a lot of people don't know about either. So in January 1999, at that the second vulnerability database workshop where CVE was introduced, back then it was common vulnerability enumeration. And then Dr. Spafford brought up the finger utility, saying, well, this thing is really not a vulnerability. It's working as designed, right?
Like
And so
every
there
good
was,
engineer says, it's
yeah, yeah.
product
So
engineering, right?
there was this, back and forth. So Steve Christie is like, I want to keep my acronym because, it's a very nice sounding acronym, CVE. So he's in the parking lot of Wendy's eating French fries, and he goes, you know what? Exposure, common vulnerability and exposure. So a lot of people don't know these interesting stories, but I've been really blessed lately to get the opportunity to talk to who's who of CVE, NVD. I'm talking to Karen Scarfoni next week about her history of CVE and NVD and CVSS score, and yeah, I just been really blessed lately to talk to some really interesting people.
Well, I'll say we've been looking forward to this conversation for months, for that same reason, right? Because it's rare that we get to dig in like this with someone someone who's both a practitioner and an academic on these topics, right? And in this space, and that has so many years of experience in cybersecurity. So we're going to learn a lot in the next 30 minutes or so. This is very
I'm
exciting.
Suddenly I
waiting for the
became like
Ken.
an old guy overnight, just the other
No,
day.
no. It's just I'm getting ready for the Ken Burns documentary to come out. I mean, like it's the exact same thing. 40 years from now, we're gonna be hearing about the Wendy's French fries and how that developed cybersecurity. That's all I'm saying.
You know,
Yeah, yeah. So one thing, Johnny, you've been at IBM for a long time, and your title recently changed from Chief Architect of Vulnerability Management to Chief Architect of Exposure Management. And as you mentioned, right, CV has the word exposure in it, but this is it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting point to me because there's kind of a movement right now in the market to essentially rebrand what has been known as vulnerability management for many, many years, and vulnerability assessment for that matter, to exposure management and sometimes attack surface management, but we'll put that aside for the time being. I think Gartner in particular has been busy promoting their CTEM framework for the last couple of years, and soon they're going to release a couple of new Magic Quadrants that tie to that approach and that framework. So I think that exposure management is going to be how we talk about this area of cybersecurity in the future, whether we like it or not. But one thing that's interesting to me is that when we talk to a lot of practitioners in this space, they don't use the term exposure a lot in conversations, just naturally much at all. And so I guess my question to you is how do you differentiate between vulnerability and exposure management, and what really kind of what prompted the title change on your side?
so if you look at the history of vulnerability scanners, um, it's kind of interesting how they started out. Really, we can, it really started out from a SIM point of view. We need to capture attacks to test out the SIM. So that's actually how, Chris Kloss with the ISS scanner, Peter Mell with the Global Attack Toolkit. While he was in college working, I think he got a scholarship from DARPA, and so he was going and capturing these things, right? And so you have this traditional vulnerability management, the CVE concept, but you can actually see it evolving, in that second conference. Well, how about web application vulnerabilities? And then we get into the world of audit compliance. Well, how about, like CIS benchmarks, violations? Now, the thing is, all these things have been, here for years, but the concept of actually putting them together into one centralized place, to where you have this reporting platform that's the connective tissue, then what's the next step of being able to connect the dots and create fidelity between, a traditional vulnerability and then a CWE and then maybe, a STEG violation, right?
Right.
And so that's really what got us from traditional vulnerability management to where I always felt, like you see some clients where traditional CVE vulnerability management might be one team, and then another team is doing web application scanning, another team is doing source code scanning. But now we're getting into an age where we're that connective tissue of these different platforms being able to go and ingest and normalize. And that's the most expensive thing to vulnerability management, going and normalizing that data.
We know, Johnny. We know.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, mountains and mountains of data and getting them to talk to, then getting into attack exposure management, right? Or analysis. And there's so many different tools that go and look at it from all different angles. But so that's why. And
Yep.
also, you know, being able to combine, vulnerability or exposure management, to a SIM, and being able to now look at the fidelity. So what's typically the first defense of clients, from maturity? They're going to have some sort of EDR, running on their endpoint, some sort of hygiene tool running on their endpoint that's going and sending to a SIEM. But now you have a new problem. You have all this noise in being able to correlate it to something actionable, like, some sort of vulnerability, whether it's a CVE, CWE, or STEC violation. Being able to do that is extremely powerful. And so, that's why we moved there, because now there's the ability to create that fidelity and take action on an objective from the lens of a SOC SIM engineer, from the lens of, hey, from a vulnerability management point of view, if we're providing remediation governance, by the way, this thing just got attacked, we need to go and get that fixed.
Right.
So so between 2018 and now, I think we have seen the most growth in vulnerability management, and it's just going to continue with machine learning and AI that uses the machine learning correctly.
For sure. I have a question about that. That's fascinating. So just to kind of dig in on one point you made, it sounds like the problem of vulnerability management it's always been there in terms of all these different types of data, right? I mean, you mentioned the example of, second conference ever having questions around web app scanning. But I even just remember when I first got started in the industry, 10 or so years ago. It's too many years ago, but it was basically, we were, even just the Nessuses of the world or the Qualises of the world were spitting out CVEs and non-CVEs, and they were still trying to glue those together. So I feel like this is a thing that's been going on for a long time. So my question is, do you feel like that what's really changed is that actually there were technological gaps and technological challenges that just, like, for example, like, they weren't necessarily great at gluing all that together, even if they were generating the data, right? Like, I remember like the WAS modules and the VM modules kind of just being totally separate things, right? It's like, yes, they're all in the same, under the same brand, but they're really separate tools. So do you
Yeah.
really feel like that has been the shift towards this? Is just the technology is more available?
The technology that has the ability to normalize that data, being able to uh, correlate data points, like, it's one thing to, like, have a CVE, but to have a CWE out there, externally facing machine, business critical, and being able to, okay, so the way to break in might not gain you, uh, the privilege escalation, but there might be a CVE that now we can exploit. So the CWE provided the window into the machine, and now you get to explore, well, what else can I do? And that was the beauty of being a penetration tester. It was short-lived at IBM, creating helping create the vulnerability management practice was actually an accident. I was doing a penetration test, and to my manager at the time, Steve Osepik, my mentor, he is like the brain trust of brain trust, this guy. And so, Steve, if I embarrassed you, I'm sorry. Um,
Hey, look, my mentor is a Steve also. There's always a
yeah,
Steve.
it's always a Steve, right? So at the time, you go and you break in, you write this rock star report, you throw it over the proverbial wall. But I was like, that's not enough, because I came from the world of, audit compliance. I used to run the Big Fix team for 10 years, and part of the job was fixing, you know. And I was like, we really need to do more with these reports. We need to, get into fixing. And he was like some sort of vulnerability remediation management. I was like, yeah, that. He was like, no, we need to stay the heck away from that. We're an offensive unit, In about 3 months later, at my kid's swimming lesson or meet or something like that, he was like, that thing we were talking about? He goes, let's go do that. And that kind of led into the first patent, being able to prioritize vulnerabilities according to weaponized intelligence. So instead of doing a pen test for this very large bank, They were like, you know what? We have millions and millions of vulnerabilities, and we don't know what to fix first, according to CVSS. And, I respect the CVSS score. It's a venerated score. It's based on severity. I get it. And there's pieces of it now that have, allowed, risk to be brought in. But at that point in time, 2017, it wasn't like that, right? So then we pretty much automated hacker research, going out to Metasploit, the Exploit DB, Millworm, and all these different places, Packet Storm, and being able to, I don't want to, I mean, it's not a pure risk score. I don't think that really exists. Maybe EPSS is the closest thing to it. And that's a call out to Jay Jacobs. I'm a big fan of him too. But um, being able to go and say, hey, with an unbounded score, and people don't like this either, but like for like for Eternal Blue, when it came out, I saw it go from 13 weaponized exploits to maybe there's 300 plus, right? But for Log4j, there's over 1,000 different exploits. So I don't really believe in like a bounded score. I know that they should exist, but I want to know at the top of that risk appetite pyramid, what is absolutely the most important thing to fix? And so that was 2018. And so now everybody's playing with the word asset contextualization, right? And, being able to understand, well, where does this device live, on the network, internal, external, DMZ? What's its asset criticality, critical, high, medium, and low? And who's the remediation team? And that's not, always easy to figure out because there's probably an OS team, app team, database team. And so you want to know the real problem to vulnerability management. It has nothing to do with the technology. The technology is there. It's about understanding the battlefield, risk management 101. And, I've said this on other podcasts, but I still believe it to this very day. But the battlefield is a digital symphony of zeros and ones harmoniously communicating across assets and devices and people, process, procedure, applications. It's exhausting, right? And so one of the things that we do that creates a lot of value add is to go and tag and bag assets inside of whatever platform, whatever vulnerability platform, and then being able to leverage that and go and enrich um, a client's CMDB. And so that's, and I'm not, it's nothing, unique to, where I work, but I think that's what's special about vulnerability management practitioners is we're not responsible for figuring out your asset inventory, but after a very seasoned team comes in, suddenly vulnerabilities are going down. And what does that do? That benefits risk management, change management, identity access management, anything management, incident response. And I think that's where we're going next because asset contextualization is like, a very hot topic right now. Along with the CTEM frameworks of the world too. But, you know, sorry, I
Yeah.
kind of weaved a lot in there, but
Yeah, I mean, everything you're talking about to me is kind of the management in vulnerability management or exposure management. And I think, Scott and I joke around sometimes and have been joking around that just that term vulnerability management was kind of hijacked way back in I guess, the late 90s, early 2000s by the vendors that were really just vulnerability detection and vulnerability reporting. There really wasn't a lot of that management that you could do with the data. And that's really why a lot of organizations kind of got into the situation where they would do a great job of scanning, right? They've bought a bunch of vulnerability management tools that are doing discovery, but they end up getting breached and looking back in some IR process, they figure out, oh yeah, we knew about this. We knew about this for 6 months or 9 months or sometimes over a year, but we didn't have the processes, the workflows, um, what you were describing with prioritization and actually organizing your data in a certain way and incorporating context. They didn't have the ability to do that in their vulnerability management tools, and so now we're seeing new tools come to market that help you do that better. And so I appreciate the kind of reframing, the rebranding to exposure management, because I feel like we did need a different we need a different way to talk about it, because when you say vulnerability management, even today, a lot of people just think detection. They just think scanners.
Yeah,
And that's,
well,
yeah.
yeah, and unfortunately, like, um, I think people try to commoditize, like vulnerability scanning. It's not just, three people in a scanner, that there's a lot more to it. And I think, like, one of our specialties is being able to go and actually create programs or mature programs or assess programs where we have, hundreds of playbooks, and we try to understand where like a client is in their maturity journey using, CMM, common capability maturity model, right? And going and looking at the 8 domains of vulnerability or exposure management, utilizing NIST 853 cybersecurity framework. A lot of Karen Scarfone's, NIST publications, patching, enterprise patching, a lot of different things, incorporating it to be able to, you want vulnerabilities fixed? Well, how are we going to mature your whole ecosystem and culture to be able to do that? And I think that's the art. That's the piece that's not commoditized anymore. But yeah, so uh,
It's funny you say that, Johnny, because, obviously doing what we do at Nucleus, we work with a ton of different VM programs over, many, many hundreds of customers at this point. And there's some really interesting patterns where, you can start to see some of the issues that are just typical in an enterprise. And one of those things is exactly what you're talking about around, hey, it's actually like working in your program versus working on your program, right? Like a vulnerability management teams that are the most successful are the ones that can elevate out of, hey, I have to basically do the office space thing of taking data from over here, translating it and giving it to some sort of remediation team, and actually saying what are the policies and processes and things that we can do to bring the business together. So one example is we were talking to one of our customers, a few weeks ago about they spend 90% of their time on helping the business figure out what the actual risk appetite, application by application of the business. So they go to, hey, this app is owned by the business team and the CTO and the CIO. We need to make them make a decision on how important, where the revenue streams are for the business. It almost has nothing to do with like what you would consider a day-to-day VM analyst job, but they're driving business decisions. And that is objectively one of the most successful VM programs that we see across the entire ecosystem we work with. So I think what you're saying is I think it hits the nail on the head. Like asset management, inventories, business risk, all of this is actually at the confluence of VM digital risk. But Steve, you look like you want to say something.
Well, it just reminds me that that was one of the topics I wanted to ask Johnny about, because I know he's spoken about in the past. I've seen some of your videos, Johnny, where you're talking about the concept of a risk operations center, and I know that's another thing. We started hearing some vendors talk about the concept of a risk operations center in the context of vulnerability and exposure management, and I know you feel pretty strongly about that concept and that approach. So, yeah, can you tell us kind of how
there's
what
an
you
evolution to that too, right?
right?
Where it first started out with a NOC, your network operations center. I remember the first time I ever saw a NOC was when my first real job out of college at WorldCom. This fish tank where they would bring in, congressmen and all sorts of things. But then you got into a security operations center. Well, now you're not only looking at network events, you're looking at events coming from, various places, firewalls, EDR, etc. But now we, got to the world of risk a risk operations center where it's, knock plus SOC plus a lot of other things, bringing in other data elements. For sure, that's where it's going to. But I think like right now, um, the normalization of data is getting mature, but it's probably not where it's at because as long as vendors are charging for these extra bells and whistles to get to a rock, I think that's going to be a problem. But once that's kind of opened up where vendors are like, hey, you know what? We're not going to charge you extra to go and ingest all these different things and normalize them, then now you'll be able to and I'm not talking bad about vendors. I'm just saying that once we get to a point where that's the norm, normalization is the norm of multiple different data sources, then you can eventually get to that rock point of view.
So
And
I'm curious when when you think about the concept of a ROC, when I think about most large enterprises that we work with, a lot of them will have risk teams, and those risk teams are generally kind of GRC oriented, compliance oriented. They're very much into control frameworks and mapping to control frameworks and stuff like that. And then they also have those large enterprises will have a vulnerability management team, and generally those are the two teams. Are it sounds like with this concept, you kind of have another small team kind of side to the risk team that's working closely with all three, right? It's kind of like the missing link, right?
yeah, it kind of goes back into the concept of exposure management, being able to create those correlation points to increase the fidelity of the event to take action, right? Because what's the problem in the industry? We have all this noise. Whether you're talking about events or the CVE haystack, I don't know. I haven't ran the numbers in about like 6 months, but out of all the CVEs, somewhere around 27% of them are actually exploitable to where you can gain privilege to a system. So remote code execution plus privilege escalation. And so that's a lot of noise to wade through. But imagine all the events. Like, again, I haven't seen the latest study, but every 17 seconds, so this is like a year-old study, every 17 seconds, anything with a binary pulse on the TCP IP stack is probed, whether malicious or not. So now aiming that information at like a corporation, like what is the noise? Well, you now need to be able to, do we block or do we don't block? Do we remediate or do we not remediate? Do we sound the fire alarms or not? So I think the rock is really an exposure management concept where you're able to not only normalize but aggregate a lot of different data points to get to I'm a big fan of NIST. I'm a fan of CTEM as well, but being able to uh, I have this concept about pushing left to action the right way. So being able, so what we're talking about, being able to go and identify all those assets. So when we go and detect those vulnerabilities, now we can action the right way, being able to respond, right? And I think that's what the, risk operations center will eventually, get to once those data sources are normalized and aggregated to where you can connect, that attack surface analysis. Because not everything, that's something interesting too. When vendors say that they do attack surface management, the next question is, are you just doing the analysis of data points, or you're looking at, the fidelity of whether it's actionable or not too? And I think that's what the rock um, or the vision of it will eventually get you to being able to use that machine learning of what uh, operational engineers do in the field, being able to learn from that and being able to use AI to go and take high fidelity actions on objectives to be able to do more of that protecting and responding, right?
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah, before we move on, I guess the last point I'll make on here is, first of all, just every time I hear that statistic, because obviously we've seen that same research around like every 17 seconds, like a probe happens. I just think back to like the old commercials from the 90s where it's like every 2 minutes a dentist fills a cavity, in a bad way. So hop on our class action lawsuit. I don't know why it just comes up every time. So I was trying not to laugh while you were
But
talking, and so that wasn't at you.
well, I taught a class, so I think I've taught 107 classes now in the last 13 years, and most of them have been in ethical hacking. So we're talking about the concept of every 17 seconds. And right now, um, I'm so in order to capture students and keep them, I immediately teach them how to break into devices and to, you know,
Oh
uh,
yeah, man.
yeah, so
When you get your first RDP
so
connection and you're
yeah.
sold, right?
So the first quarter of the class is, hey, this is the really cool stuff, but now let me show you how to do it professionally. Being able to, from an OSI network point of view, are the lights home? What IP addresses do you find? And then from a TCP point of view, going and seeing what services exist, etc.
Got to
But
get the dopamine hit early, right?
That's right.
so every that whole
Before the
every
report writing sets
7 seconds,
in.
I was like, hey, go and scan your house. See what's there. I mean, I don't know if you guys have home automation, but I do. And what I realized about most of my home automation, it's really easy to break into.
That's why I
And
don't.
right, and they're always, talking back to the mothership somewhere. So
Well,
now
the
you,
toaster has to report back the
yeah,
the brownness
copying
of
at
the
your
bread.
toaster, blinds or whatever it is, right? And so I think that's really interesting too, is, eventually there's going to be, some sort of home vulnerability exposure management that's going to run in the house. And that might be like a future service, right? But
Well, Scott and I have talked about going down market in our business, but I don't know if we'll ever make it that far down. But I could see a world where you need something like that.
Yeah, we just need to make sure that we can install CrowdStrike agents on everything. I mean, that's the obviously the answer, right? EDR everything done.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, we won't take down every single IoT device in the world. Uh, was that
yeah.
was that a bad statement to make? I don't know. Don't come after me, Dimitri.
I'm curious. I'm curious, Johnny. Like a lot of this domain in cybersecurity is very much kind of people and process oriented, but to a large extent, we are kind of dependent on technology evolving to do a better job of in these areas, right, of vulnerability and exposure management. So just from someone that has so much knowledge, like historical knowledge of the space, and so much experience with different vulnerability and exposure management tools and software and whatnot, what do you see as like the biggest gaps today in the technology, or the biggest weaknesses, and what do you see, I guess, in the coming years, changing with regard to the technology side of the house and the vendor side of the house?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer that question a little differently. Um, so if I was a brand new CISO somewhere, and that is probably, I would say, the most difficult job in cybersecurity. The average lifespan of a CISO is 17 months, according to Carnegie Mellon, and going past that is a very low percentage. Make it past 17 months. And my biggest piece of advice is to know the battlefield. Number one is like, what is the culture in your environment that's preventing you to be able to protect your assets? Do you even know your assets, right? So That's what, that external exposure management gets you. Understanding the rogue devices, understanding shadow IT devices. And and so a lot of times the CISO is, somehow gets the responsibility for asset management. But asset management traditionally belongs to the CIO. So creating that partnership, being able to have some sort of mandate, and this is where I've seen it work best. When you have the mandate to work with all the different remediation teams to go and start work, because vulnerability exposure management is a team sport. It's not just the vendor, right? Being able to work with them collectively, put together a somewhat decent asset management process. So that's number one. So how do we prevent vulnerability backlog? I call it, old bleeding. Well, first you got to stop the new bleeding, because new bleeding becomes old bleeding, right?
Yep.
So step number one, asset inventory. Create the culture where everybody's participating and make it part of GRC, a device activation process. Wouldn't it be cool to live in a world? And this is the world that I grew up in, like, back in the WorldCom, the Williams, the SAIC days, before we got this warm, fuzzy, intrinsic keyword, the cloud, we had these traditional data centers where if you wanted to build a new device, you would have to go through an act of red tape, an act of God to get the device, where you had to create this ticket. So this is nothing new. You have to create this ticket. It gets approved. You build this device with, a golden hardened image. You need to have this 6-pack suite of tools, on it. And there would be an inventory record. Check, check, check. This device is happy and hardened,
Yep.
right?
I remember those days very clearly.
Yeah,
I'm glad
so
I don't, to be honest.
we need to get back to that world of where your change management platform is the same as your inventory management platform. I never understood that. Some clients will have inventory over here, change management over here, but why not put it under one umbrella where your inventory is part of change, and so any device that needs something can immediately have a change record? And that's where this is something beautiful too. There's a couple of vendors in this space. Wouldn't it be cool to live in the world where a platform can manage a vulnerability, the vulnerability lifecycle from its initial identification to its final remediation? So imagine the world where a ticket meets a threshold, because you don't want to have a ticket for everything. So immediately a change record is created. And upon approval of that change record, this vulnerability platform will go and fix. And so that's what a lot of, I think you're going to hear this a lot more soon. There is a big difference between vulnerability remediation and patch management. Traditional patch management deals with fixing the kernel. It deals with the APARs that come out for that specific vendor. But how do most vulnerability platforms work? They're built for optimization. We are going to club together all these CVEs into one vulnerability ID. And so and I'm not trying to mention any vendors, but if you use the native OS platform for Windows, for Red Hat, for whatever, it's going to halfway fix some of those vulnerabilities. That was the case in point for Eternal Blue for years.
Right.
You would go and fix all the patches, but not all the registry edits, right? And then upon approval of that change record, then that tool will go and fix all the elements of a vulnerability. And so for me, that is actually more special than the rock, because if I can build that foundation with the client of their asset inventory, then slowly but surely I can get to this orchestrated process where now we can go and include the remediation teams as part of that GRC framework through the lens of a vulnerability platform to go and fix. And that's really special. So I know like 3 vendors today that are doing that. And that's, to me, that's the biggest breakthrough after being able to prioritize based on risk as opposed to severity, you know.
Makes sense. It makes sense. Yeah. Johnny, I think, well, not I think, I know you're like a fountain of vulnerability and exposure management knowledge on the practical side, but you also do a lot on the academic side, and I want to make sure we have time to get into that as well. So I want to just like switch gears for a moment um, and talk about that. You graduated originally back in 2000, as did I,
Yeah.
showing my age here. Um,
Yeah.
can
No
you?
comment, guys. No comment.
Actually, actually 98 is the first
Oh,
time
okay.
I
Okay.
graduated.
So what motivated you to go back, essentially to go back to college after what I think was close to like a 20-year sabbatical there? And if you're able to share, I'd
Yeah.
really love to hear about the research you're doing and the dissertation that you're working on.
So my dad, he was born in Damascus, Syria, and he was a college professor at Oklahoma State University, and he was the department head there. He built the geology program, and so I saw this PhD growing up. So that was one of the reasons why I wanted to do it. But it's interesting. So I graduate summer of '98, and I go to work for WorldCom, who is really a wholesale network internet company. By the way, I have a very interesting story about how the United States internet was created out of WorldCom and Williams Communications. But during that time, about 6 months into the job, he goes, "So what are you doing to grow?" And I'm talking, I'm learning, I'm going to date myself. I'm learning Perl programming to go and parse this and that because back then, Perl was the language of parsing. And he goes, "Well, you're in networking now." I was like, "Yeah." And he goes, "Well, now you need to work on a master's degree in networking." So what was cool, Oklahoma State University in Stillwater opened up a branch in Tulsa. So that's where I was working at the time. And 2 semesters before I graduated, I took uh, an elective class in digital cyber warfare. And that was crazy because at WorldCom where I was working, we were, doing our job, and as fun, you would play jokes on each other, breaking into their systems, popping up a lot of windows. Just it was like the best time of my life back then, work wise. So anyway, digital cyber warfare, it was taught by this adjunct out of the government. We didn't know if it was CIA, FBI, or NSA, but we had to write a paper. And by the way, the books for that class were Hacking Exposed, Volume 1,
Remember that?
Digital Cyber Warfare, and The Cuckoo's Egg.
Of course.
And so, I was already hooked. I was doing that already. And he goes, "Johnny, did you know that the University of Tulsa down the road is one of 5 schools in the country that are teaching NSA cyber core security?" So at that time, um, I think back in 2000-ish, yeah, 2000, it was Georgia Tech, Carnegie Mellon, Stanford, MIT, and the University of Tulsa. And so I was actually doing 2 master's degrees at the same time, finishing up the networking and starting the NSA Cyber Core one. And a lot of people ask, well, why the heck the University of Tulsa? Well, first of all, it's a top 10 computer science school in the country. But what was interesting is at that point in time, 67% of the United States internet ran through the heart of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Why is that? Well, contrary to popular opinion, Houston is not the oil and gas capital of the United States. It's really Tulsa, Oklahoma, a lot of people would probably argue Cushing or Pawhuska. And so in the early 80s, when oil and gas wasn't doing so well, Bernie Ebbers, uh, the CEO of WorldCom, I think he went to jail eventually. And then Keith Bailey, the president of Williams Energy, were in Bad Brads in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. What are we going to do with our oil and gas pipeline? And Bernie was like, you know what? Have you ever heard of fiber? And Keith was like, yeah. He goes, well, we're going to clean out our oil and gas pipeline, use it as conduit to run fiber through the heart of this country. And so that is actually how the United States fiber wholesale network was born between WorldCom and really Williams Energy. Nobody knows this story except for probably people that work there. So now you
And all 90 of our VulnWise listeners now, Johnny.
yeah. So what's interesting now, you will see most telecommunication companies, have their roots in oil and gas. But anyway,
Yeah.
so I did the NSA Cyber Core Security, Dr. Hell, Sajid Shenoy, Dr. Papa, and many others. And so I got to a point where my kids got older, and then I had, several patents as like, and they gave me the opportunity to go back to school because that's my calling. I've been teaching college classes, not at a university level, but when I eventually retire, I'd like to retire as a college, a university professor, so that's why I did it. And the research will make for a good book. Did you guys know? And I know, Scott, I was telling you this earlier, but the very inception of the ARPANET was actually a buffer overflow. So there was a UCLA developer, Charlie Klein, was sending the first remote message over the ARPANET to a Stanford Research Institute computer. It's like a SDS 940 computer. And so back then, if you're at the keyboard to log in, you would type in LOG to log in. So they were transmitting this over the ARPANET between UCLA and Stanford. And so the L and the O was sent, and as they were sending the G, it caused a buffer overflow. That's the very inception of why we need vulnerability databases. And then you see the whole history of, like MIT developing Multics and, Berkeley developing their flavor of Unix. And you're seeing these different, tribes of academia now saying, hey, we need to be keeping vulnerability lists. We need to fix these things, right? And so that's part of the PhD. Like, ultimately, my dissertation is going to be in scoring using, um, exploitation, weaponized intelligence to prioritize using action research, which is a whole nother field. But it's interesting to go and tell the real stories of behind how CVSS scoring originated. Like, for example, there's a big argument that Elias Levy, with Security Focus, created CVSS before there was a CVSS. So I got to go and ask people like Karen Scarfoni, uh, Sasha Romanowski, their points of view. But how did CVE get created? So we went over, that story a little bit with Dave Mann and Steve Christie, and how did NVD originate, and same thing with CISA, right? And all these other scoring systems. Did you know that there was a scoring system called CMSS for configurations? Or how did CPE originate, right? I mean, just all these different things where which one which one received the correct fertilizer to grow, right? And so a lot of people
Yeah.
don't, talk about like Sands, for instance, with Allen, God rest his soul, but he was really instrumental of getting, MITRE together. So right after that second workshop, he got MITRE together with Cisco, IBM, and Microsoft, and suddenly all these vendors really started using. And I think it was called the Birds of the Feather conference right after that second workshop. But
Wow.
then I
Sounds
got
like
in on Dr. Spafford a lot, and then I was talking about Brian Martin and Scott Moore. So a lot of these giants. So to be honest with you, I know like this much, and then I tap on these guys to focus my energy somewhere else. But with the help of Brian Martin, Mark Dossier, Gene Spafford, we were actually able about a month ago to uncover the first, and also Tim Grants, we were able to uncover the history of the very first vulnerability database workshop. And that was hosted in 1996 out of Virginia. So I intend to write a white paper on that missing piece of history. But, how did this all start? It's nice to know.
I was going to suggest you write a book on the history of
So
vulnerability
Oh, I think he
management.
is, man.
Brian, Brian
We can't imagine that he's not at this point.
Brian Martin and I, that's our plan. Like I said, I feel like a kindergartner next to people like Brian and Scott Moore and others. But I also had a lot of guidance from Jay Jacobs too. So a
Yeah.
combination of those folks, and Peter Melville answering now and then. Like what about this? What about that? But it's really it's kind of like NBA basketball, like everybody knows LeBron James and people still know of Michael Jordan. Hopefully that stays that way. But, how about, the Connie Hawkins, the Dr. J's, the Oscar Robinsons, the Pete Maraviches of the world? Like, where did all this begin? And so that's what I intend to do for vulnerability database history. Try to do the same thing for scoring, and then hopefully I can actually get the dissertation done. But
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, that seems like a great place to leave it. We're way over the time that we normally do. As everybody listening at home, like obviously you could tell, just probably feel the excitement from myself and Steve through the camera here. But man, we could talk for another couple hours about this kind of stuff. We really looking forward to the dissertation. You don't just have it, you're not just writing it for the PhD. You're also writing it for all of your new raving fans, because we would love for you to share it with us when you're done. And absolutely, man. So we appreciate your time, and everybody at home, thank you again for tuning in. Again, this was a episode of the VulnWise Show where we are hoping you took something away from a great fountain of knowledge, Johnny Shaieb from IBM. Thank you so much for joining us
thank
today,
you
Johnny.
guys. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Johnny. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
See y'all.